for our archives. So just know if you have any questions during the Q&A period, those will be recorded and in the SNU archives. As many of you know, my name is Anza Yarshka. I'm the gallery director at Sierra Nevada University, and I'm also the program assistant for the MFA in Interdisciplinary Arts program. This is our final lecture during the residency of our lecture series. We are thrilled to be welcoming Matt Freedman this evening. And I'm going to read a little bit of Matt's bio. Something that I just find so exciting about Matt is that he has been with the program since its inception. He taught in the very first residency of the MFA-IA here and has been with us this whole time. So he knows what's up. He knows this program inside and out, taught for us, and is also just an amazing artist in his own vein. So Matt Freedman is a sculptor, graphic artist, performer, writer, and curator with a background in cartooning and anthropology. His current work explores the consequences when DIY versions of modern spectacles revive half-remembered cultural myths. Solo exhibitions include Pierogi Gallery in Brooklyn, vertexList in Brooklyn, Studio 10 Gallery in Brooklyn, Valentine Gallery in Queens, Flipside Brooklyn, FiveMyles Brooklyn, and SculptureCenter New York. Freedman has performed at PS1 MoMA in New York, the Brooklyn Museum, the Kitchen in New York, Brooklyn Fireproof, Brooklyn Academy of Music at FiveMyles, Galapagos Art Space in Brooklyn, the Flux Factory in New York. Freedman has curated projects at SculptureCenter in New York, Long Island University Outdoor Sculpture Exhibition, and PS1 MoMA in New York. He is the recipient of the National Endowments for the Arts Grant in 1991 and the New York Foundation of the Arts Grant Fiction Writing in 2000, as well as the author of the graphic journal Relatively Indolent but Relentless, published by 7 Stories Press in 2014. So if that doesn't clue you into how amazing Matt is and what wonderful things we're in store for, I don't know what will. So as usual, we're going to have you turn off your videos while Matt talks. At the end of Matt's talk performance, we'll invite you to turn them back on for the Q&A session, and feel free to use the chat during the talk, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll go from there. So Matt, I'm gonna hand it fully over to you and dip out with my video off as well.
All right. Thanks so much for that. Hi, everybody. I see a lot of faces I recall. I was trying to give you a brief nostalgic refresher in all the things we're missing from Incline Village, the trees. Here's a fish from Sage Hen. Room. Just a little bit, I mean, many of you have seen some of these performances before. So I'll give you a little bit of background. For me, it's in lieu of the much less satisfying sort of text talks of,
Matt, you just muted yourself.
I see, I better not move the screen. Every time I move the screen, it mutes for some reason. Somebody, I think my brother keeps bringing in for one of them. I never liked the carousel slide talks, and I never really mastered a PowerPoint presentation of my own work. But there is a kind of ancient tradition going back to the early days of Chautauqua talks and even vaudeville called lightning sketches or chalk talks, in which a drawing would accompany a lecture on some subject which might or may not be terribly edifying. It was originally used in church talks as a mnemonic device to help with teach scripture. So, when Abraham, his eyes saw the ram in the bushes, a picture would conveniently appear that would drill that image into the consciousness of the audience. Of course, being a fatally flawed species, we quickly turned from religion to bigotry, and in the vaudeville performances, which were a form of minstrelsy, these drawings would often take on a form of extreme ethnic caricature. So the artist may say, "I saw a man named Cohen on the road today." I said, "Hi," and then you see Cohen's name comes a beard, some kind of caricature of an Orthodox Jew. For a while, I performed these talks, sort of reconfiguring these traditional forms that were collected by Harry Houdini, of all people. But then gradually, it became more interesting to find other forms. For a while, I was drawing other people's cartoons, like Nancy, a mid-century, 20th century cartoon, which emphasized a kind of iconic representation of images. Everything was sort of a perfected icon: 3 stones, 1 perfect tree. Most specifically, Ernie Bushmiller, who created the form, was in a kind of all-out war against modern art, by which he meant abstract art, which he always was represented in this similarly iconic fashion. 3 squiggles, 4 squares, 1 circle. It was sort of an ancient fight between representation and abstraction, between a kind of responsibility on the part of the artist and a kind of sense that art was in some sense a con. It seems very primitive, maybe as a kind of dynamic in art to today, but the fight between a kind of perceived cultural elite and a kind of reasonable hoi polloi is in fact terribly relevant. I'm obviously in so much strange circumstances as I speak to you today, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm in a chair that I can't get out of. Oh, Judy's adjusting me. I'm on oxygen and other things we'll talk about later. I can't really leave this space I'm in, except when I go out in the world to seek more medical treatment. I've been fighting a cancer for 8 years, and it's getting later and later in the game, and I'm losing more and more of my independence from it. That's just the nature of the beast. It makes me also think a lot, as we live in these very strange times with the pandemic and the protests on the street and the wholesale rethinking of our national identity. This has always been, and is particularly now, a responsibility of artists to think about these issues, but I find myself so constrained and contained by my own body, limitations of my body, that I feel I have not only no authority to speak beyond the body, but that I have to think about all these things through my body, through what my body is going through. It's the only profound thing I understand at this point, and it substitutes for me the comforts of theory and metaphor. So I think as we go forward, I'll try to understand and explain to you what's happening to me as I understand it through the lens of my own visceral, corporal, fatal circumstance. This all began about almost exactly 8 years ago, a couple of years before I started coming out to SNU, when I discovered an earache revealed a cancer that had spread throughout my body already. A very slow cancer, but a relentless one. I remember that one of the first and most moving times I shared this information was with, not outside of my family, was with my volleyball team, on which Julia was our star setter and defensive player. I remember how moving it was to see the impacts, to feel the impact of sharing that kind of information with your loved ones. I went to Boston. I was fitted with a radiation mask and went through a month of intense bombardment with protons on my head and neck, which did a pretty good job of containing the situation. For a good deal of time. The main stress of that circumstance was trying to stay off a feeding tube, which they said I would have to do if I lost too much weight. And that struggle to retain independence, which I won at the time, was sort of the focal point of all my energy and the definition of my sense of my resistance to my own disease. It did have the effects eventually of robbing me of my voice temporarily. And although I continued to perform those vaudeville shows with Nancy, I realized I wanted to explain myself more clearly, but without my voice, it turns out I had to use the drawing itself, which here was in front of my body, as a way of explaining myself. I discovered I had the ability, which I think I probably share with most everybody if they tried it, of being able to draw upside down. And with my friend Tim Spirios, a percussionist, I began to perform kind of silent blues songs, a kind of form of poetry where I'd write the songs out while he played, and I could communicate that way in a kind of satisfying form. As my voice returned, I was able to use the platform to draw and talk again. And I had about 6 years, 6.5 good years where I was ill, but I was not incapacitated. As my oncologists like to say, you're doing your thing, you're playing volleyball. We repeat over and over again, which seemed trivial. Now I realize it wasn't quite so trivial. And after about 6.5 years, though, I began to notice symptoms, difficulty climbing stairs, then difficulty climbing, sustaining my energy. I was going slower and slower, using less and less of my independence as it dried away. And eventually I had to go into the hospital with a completely separate virus in the early days of COVID, very similar to COVID. I was in the hospital for 6 days on around Valentine's Day. And when I came out, my world had shrunk to the scale of my apartment. A bed, a table, a chair, kitchen, a bathroom. I could move from one to the other fairly easily. I was dependent on this technology. I saw this as a kind of a map of the known universe and the outside world full of dolphins and monsters. Sort of aped the sense of early world maps where the known universe and the unknown universe were in some sort of almost religious contention with each other. The great crisis of those early months of incapacity was with this air hose, which runs behind my ear and then down to a 50-foot length to a machine back here. And I was constantly terrified of being tangled up in the hose and cutting off my air, falling, to the point where I began to think of the air hose as a kind of monster, a many-headed monster, many mouths seeking to devour me, like the Hydra that Hercules fought. And I lived this way for about 6 months in isolation as the world continued to fall apart around me. About 6 weeks ago, I've noticed that my weight, which had always been a bit of an issue, had begun to slide again. If I weighed 185 pounds when healthy, and somewhere around 170 to 160 pounds for most of the time I was healthy, suddenly I was weighing in the 150s, and then in the 140s, then the 130s. And then one fine day I woke up, I was at the scale and I weighed 129 pounds, 28. And that was a little too scary to tolerate. Doctors felt I was not eating because of the deterioration of the muscles in my neck, but also because I was in danger of aspirating, meaning that the food that I took in would come into my lungs. I would become, without pneumonias like I was showing in those viruses, that would further compromise my ability to breathe and feed this vicious cycle of loss and weakness and difficulty maintaining my energy. I went into the hospital and was fitted with a feeding tube, which is coming out of me here. I'm always eating. This may be the first lecture ever where, maybe not, I shouldn't say that. That's hubris. But I am having dinner while we speak. In fact, I have dinner all the time. I have breakfast all the time. I'm hooked up to this thing at least 12 hours a day as it gently slips a high-calorie formula into my stomach. She bought me this gorgeous easy chair, which I'm trying not to become frozen to, but it's hard. It's hard to maintain a sort of sense of civic citizenship when you're only worrying about the breath, and that the world you live in becomes its sort of own planet. And you feel you have almost no capacity to be engaged in the world except as a kind of alien onlooker. That sense is exacerbated by the way that I have to go out into the world, sometimes armed with a helmet, always armed with my oxygen tank, and now perhaps my feeding tube as well. I'm somewhere between an astronaut or a deep sea diver or some sort of cyborg moving in this artificial space. Of course, the terrible irony is of thinking about the problem of breathing as it pertains to my own completely natural and unremarkable physical deterioration, and the words being chanted on the streets of all our cities and around the world by people who can't breathe. It's hard enough that a virus or a cancer can rob you of your ability to breathe, but when it's your human, your fellows doing that to you out of fear and hatred and bigotry and historical structures of inequality, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to watch this sort of seemingly self-evident and needless horror that we perpetuate on each other, when the real problem we have is simply trying to help each other stay alive and live meaningful lives. It's hard to find meaning, as an artist does, either in metaphor or in some sort of action, when it all feels so desperate. Those hose monsters I was describing as the great fear of my early days on the air hose really wasn't the image that I was thinking of so much as the image of St. George and the Dragon, the famous tiny painting by Raphael of St. George, seemingly spearing the awful-looking monster in its lair, city behind, a princess who was about to be sacrificed or consumed somehow by the dragon in the background. That was the image I had in my mind. The real story, there are many stories of St. George and the Dragon. The one that became a golden legend, became the source of George's reincarnation as the patron saint of England, the society and economy that gave birth to our own system of justice and economics, is complicated. The original St. George was a martyr beheaded by Emperor Diocletian in the late stages of the Roman Empire. But he was reinvented as this Aryan hero on horseback 1,000 years later, as I said. The story was that a small town somewhere in northern Libya was beset by a dragon that lives by a swamp. The dragon was almost literally the personification of the plague. It killed with its breath. It ate sheep, and then it ate people, and then eventually the people reached a compromise with the dragon. They would send one of their own, always a young person for some reason, to be consumed by the dragon on a regular basis, daily, weekly, monthly. They did this by drawing lots, very egalitarian of them. And the loser would have to go to the dragon's lair. one fine day, the king's own daughter was the winner of this lottery. He protested, but the people were adamant that the system would not be fair unless everyone participated. And this, they're obviously ahead of us. The princess was tied to a post. The dragon came out. I simplified the story. And St. George, a virginal Christian knight on horseback, rode up and asked what was going on. When it was explained, he said he would defeat the dragon in the name of Jesus Christ. Sorry, I've got two dragons here. He was told that was impossible, but he said with the help of God and Jesus, he would accomplish his feat. He did not actually kill the dragon, as the picture seems to imply. He merely subdued the dragon, excuse me. And then he had the princess untie herself and throw her girdle over the neck of the dragon, which subdued the dragon. All the accounts say the dragon was now as docile as a pet. The dragon was essentially in custody. The dragon was under arrest. And St. George and the princess returned to the village with the dragon on a leash in cuffs. The people were afraid, and George said, if you all convert, I will slay the dragon and you will be safe. So they converted, and they chopped off the head of the dragon and they put it on a wagon and they took it out of town. They essentially traded their safety for the acceptance of George's temporal power, the deal that we do daily. The motif of the writer, St. George, is actually an old one. I said, it has less to do with St. George's story itself as a tradition of the Thracian horsemen, a kind of cult society where riders on horseback would grant wishes. They're often buried with poor people. Trees and snakes were part of this imagery. They persisted for over 1,000 years, and as with many pre-Christian traditions, the Christian religion adapted a pre-existing cultural trope. As my own condition deteriorated, my association with my horse moved from a pedestrian to a stool. I remember the first time I thought I'd have to lean on a stool to give a talk. And I was fascinated by the stool, to the point where I developed a whole talk on the War of the Golden Stool in the Ashanti fought against the colonial British, a tremendously successful campaign because they were offended that the colonial governor insisted on sitting on their chair, a golden chair, which was the personification of their entire culture. And they managed to maintain a homeland until their country was absorbed, became independent in Ghana. I had a student from Ghana who returned home during the pandemic in the fall, So I was able to talk to him from Accra, and I asked him about the myth of the golden, not the myth, but the war of the golden stool, which he said, well, that's just the Ashanti. They're back here, but it's a beautiful story. After I passed through the stool stage, I sat for months in a real office chair to the point where I began to be convinced I was part of the chair. Now I'm in an even bigger chair, swallowing me up. What waits me next, of course, is the bed, which I think I may never get out. Try to move things along. But I have to say, if you're getting too depressed by this, that it's impossible to be alive and not to be with some kind of hope. There are many tricks up the sleeves of the doctors. A few months ago, I went through a debulking operation to try to remove some of the tumors at the ends of the bronchi in my lungs. The effects would have more air rush into my system that had previously been blocked. And for a day or two, I remember having that feeling. Suddenly I could walk my dog and climb stairs. I even did research on the physics of a cork coming out of a champagne bottle, because that's what it felt like. If you want to know how a pop of champagne is generated, it's C, the speed of sound, over 2 pi, plus I believe, square root of the area in the neck of the bottle of champagne divided by the volume of the bottle itself times an adjustment factor. I don't know what the adjustment factor is. That's not very much help. The question for me at this point, insofar as there's any question about my own relationship to my circumstance, is if I'm an optimist or a pessimist about all this. There's certainly ample grounds for either. For us, optimism and pessimism, glass half full, glass empty, is a psychological question. But its history, going back to the Enlightenment, is a more of a religious question. The question of whether this is a good world run by a just God, or a bad or chaotic world run by an indifferent, effectless, or somehow unengaged God. We often look at Leibniz, the last great world genius, as the last great religious optimist, as we would define it. Not only did he develop calculus on his own, but he also developed this theory that everything was somehow arranged in a way where you could say we were in the best of all possible worlds. And even during his time, he came under attack from intellectuals and skeptics like Voltaire, who parried his position gleefully and Candide. In a way, is a misrepresentation of what Leibniz's position is. The best of all possible worlds does not imply a good world, or a world where everything is positive. It just means that a moral, supernatural power who brings the universe into being through the sheer force of will has an infinite number of worlds to pick between. And the world that we live in is not a perfect world, but simply better than all the other worlds that this deity had also the power to create. The suffering, which is very real in this world, is important simply because it teaches us that there's more than simple pleasure in the world. We need to attend to the relationships between each other somehow. This became increasingly associated with a kind of despair and a sort of blaming, perhaps we would say, of the deity for putting us in this position in the first place. If before we didn't question the existence and the motives of a God who put us there, after people like Schopenhauer got to work, we had to. Schopenhauer and his hero Buddha saw a world full of pain, animated only by our will to life. But the horror of our lives, which apparent to us in a way is not apparent to the other animals that suffered similarly, our awareness led to our despair. A mole has the same will to life as we do, but we have the curse of our expectations. He said, only compare the pain of an animal being devoured by another with the pleasure of the animal doing the devouring, and you'll see what a horrible world we live in. He also said to look at the hideous faces of all people, and you would know from that what a painful world we lived in. Others thought he was a pain in the neck. That might guess a little bit farther along to Camus and the existentialists. They saw this all as a kind of absurdity. Of course, death was inevitable, but our attempt to contest with the inevitability and pointlessness of existence was the heart of the absurd condition. We would struggle against absurdity because it needed us to do so, but we could never escape it, and we should live with an acceptance of its inevitability and the pointlessness of resistance, even as we resisted. In his novel, The Plague, a small Algerian city is beset with a plague which strips away all the pretense of ordinary bourgeois life that we've constructed around ourselves to convince ourselves that life has meaning and real pleasure that has consequence. And people reveal themselves in extremis of their positions. Exactly how strongly and with what sense of purpose and duty they oppose death and hopelessness. For Camus, the only question really was suicide. You end the suffering by ending your own life. He would say no, because that would be to give in to this notion of the absurd and try to escape it. The profound experience of absurdity is to struggle against death and meaninglessness as an end in itself, to embrace life as fully as possible as a form of heroic, if doomed, struggle. And the very hopelessness with which you face this fate defines your understanding of your true circumstances. This hero in this is Sisyphus, the Greek hero who actually outwitted death for many years until when he was finally taken to Hades and was put to work rolling this rock up a hill, only have it roll down every time and have to go back and repeat the action. What Camus says is that he's interested in Sisyphus when the rock is back at the bottom of the hill and he's going down to fetch it back up again, fully aware of the agony that awaits him and the hopelessness of his situation. But now, for temporary time freed from the rock itself, he can think. And in contemplating this situation, his own relationship with his fate, he accepts what he has to do and is prepared to repeat the action, not because it's a curse, but because it's in one way he can continue to oppose death itself. And Camus says, imagine Sisyphus in this situation. Imagine that he is happy. Of course, most of us aren't capable of that kind of rigor, and we look to all sorts of other ways out of the dilemma of the painfulness of our mortality. I remember as a boy looking at an old Life magazine, a picture magazine, that many of you maybe have never seen or heard of. There was a horrendous picture in the magazine of a lion catching and apparently killing a wildebeest. The wildebeest is staring out at the photographer. And according to the text, scientists have shown that the wildebeest's autonomic, its nervous system was shut down during this moment of extremis, and it was no longer in pain or struggling. It was in some sort of daze or trance state, and this was nature's way of protecting it from precisely the horror of its own demise. A 10-year-old, you might find great comfort in that. I'll try to speed myself up, but bear with me. Now that I'm on a feeding tube, I'm spared the viciousness of the lion's attack. I feel I have few illusions about how this is all going to play out in terms of painlessness. But that doesn't mean I'm not capable of maintaining my own magic thinking. For about a year, I went to see a healer named John, an unprepossessing man who would lay his hands on my shoulders because he believed he had the power in his hands to heal. He gave me images to maintain of sharks, bringing me glasses of bone healing collagen. And I liked going to see John because he was a calming ritual, a source of real assuredness. He felt he knew what he was doing. And most of the doctors had to admit they didn't know what they were doing. And that was pleasant. One of the last times I saw him, he gave me a book of his, well, a book by one of his patients, who claimed that during a session, John's face became the face of the Virgin Mary, and he thereby cured him of his cancer. But John said he would become the Virgin Mary while he treated me, and I should watch his face very carefully. I watched and I watched. Of course, I didn't see the Virgin Mary. I thought maybe his eyes were getting darker, and I said, "Your eyes are getting darker." But he was probably just squinting. He said, "Your eyes are getting darker. That's the sign of God at work." I didn't have the heart to tell him that in the bad movies I'd seen, the black eyes were, of course, the sign of the devil. John was helpful, though. He was a clarinet player, and he showed me many breathing techniques, how to breathe out with your diaphragm, how to stack your breath like a mountain climber, many ways to add more oxygen per breath than you might have started with. It really does all come back to the breath, I think, and the control of the breath, I think. In order for me not to go into a terrible spiral of oxygen deficit, I have to teach myself to remain calm, to never lose my patience, to never put myself in a position where I begin to not just stress myself, but move too fast. It's something I learned to do in short term when I was under radiation in Boston, but it's something I've never quite learned how to do. If I move as slow as possible, I will have as little problem as possible. If I think about my breath every day, every intake, every expiration, I will maintain more of a sense of balance, not only with my own body, but with the world. But I continue to fall short and put myself in a position where a cascade of side effects drives me into an episode where you feel as though you're drowning. I think more than magic, more than religion, in some ways, maybe it's the last refuge of a sort of pseudo-intellectual. It's the esoteric of the explanations that are offered for circumstances that I find most interesting. There's a notion that these mythologies, stories of St. George or Hercules, come not from myths, as Jung would say, but they're actually esoteric descriptions of somatic activity which have been conceived in ancient trance states. That activities that we use in order to achieve a kind of spiritual insight, say during yoga practices or in meditation, are obviously very much about the control of the breath. And according to this explanation, it has its origins in physical activity. There are distant ancestors, hunters, who pursued their game in utter silence, had to learn to control their breath, suppress their breath, to the point that they would inevitably enter semi-trance states. And in those trance states, they would have visions, and the visions would become interpreted. And then the visions themselves, the techniques for achieving them, would be passed on as a kind of strong knowledge from one generation to another as a literal embodiment of the motions of the body as it consumes oxygen. And here's the hunter, here's its prey. This explanation also argues that we're fascinated by heavy breathing animals like asses or horses or swine, particularly because their reliance on breath mimics our own preoccupation with our own breath. And then our fascination with the horse and the rider is a sort of fusion of ourselves, our sort of ancient understanding of ourselves as these breathing, hunting creatures. Images of horses and riders entering spaces, say the Trojan horse of the Greeks, or Jesus Christ riding the ass into Jerusalem, are actually manifestations in myth form of the entrance of the transition into the space between the eyes, in our own bodies as we achieve a trance state. And this, thanks, our old friend Sisyphus comes back to us. Sisyphus, the hero, is actually an poetic manifestation of an ancient teaching, breath control. Sisyphus is really two words, Sisyphus. Sisyphus. Repeat. Sisyphus. You begin to hyperventilate. You begin to go into a trance. As you leave the world of consciousness, you begin to accept the absurdity, the inevitability of death, and to gently lose your mind. Thank you very much. I'm done. Oh, I believe I voice lost it. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much, Matt. We're getting a lot of claps and lots of love in the chat for you.
Hi, Matt.
Hi. Oh, wait, Julia. Well, I'm happy to say I didn't lose my voice.
You did it.
Sorry, I'm not supposed to swallow anything. Are there questions? No.
Any questions for Matt? Matt, I actually have a question for you, which is I'm really interested in the amount of research that you bring into your work or context outside of you. And I mean, I feel like your whole talk was about that, but I'm just curious how you approach that gathering of that context? Or
Mhm.
like what prompts that, or what's your process for that?
Well, as you might gather from how it comes across, it's pretty eclectic. Usually what happens is the different performances begin with some sort of motivating, animating circumstance. Either I actively look, I mean, something that may impose itself on me that I find interesting, that I want to think about. Sometimes I rely on a chance operation. Something comes through the mail, or used to find on the street. Sometimes when I was doing a lot more performances in art galleries, I would do some research into whatever the work of the artist was showing in the gallery had been doing and start there. But then once you start that, you just sort of allow one thread to lead to another, one half-remembered story to come to another. If you give yourself enough time, I wouldn't say a logical or academically defensible narrative will reveal itself. So the sort of the logic of your own interests begin to be revealed, and you sort of find yourself moving in a direction um, as you begin to try to think about, as you know, inevitably doing something like researching a stool will lead you to the War of the Golden Stool. There's a whole story of the woman who led the Ashanti in that fight against the man who was later the model for the model inspector general in the Gilbert Sullivan play, The Pirates of the Penzance. And the Pirates of the Penzance has this wonderful sort of sub-story about youth and old age, as Frederick can't leave the pirates because he was born on leap year day, and so he'll only be 21 when he's 80. And then when you get to the number, see how old he'd be in 1980, suddenly you realize that the Pirates of the Penzance exist in this colonial magic world, has tendrils that go up into the atomic age, and then suddenly your story takes another turn. So as long as you're open for that kind of randomness, you never know where you're going to get. And it sort of depends on my own intellectual and eccentric logic to drive me one place or another. So I've definitely picked up a lot of esoterica, but I would not want anybody to write a thesis based on the things that I say, because it's sort of the, as with the, with the trance state, it's almost the dream logic that I'm more interested in, underpinned by the strangeness of the world as it reveals itself through the research that I'm interested in. St. George does not kill the dragon, but only subdues him. What's the meaning there? Well, one thing, you want me to answer that, Asra? I see you in the questions. As with almost any other myth, there are many, many different versions. And as I was just saying, the version I'm most interested in is that one in particular, where he doesn't immediately kill the dragon, partly because the story and the parallels to our time are interesting, also because it was that version of the myth that was included in this compendium of Christian saint stories that led to the establishment of St. George as the patron saint of England, and the relationship that has with our politics today. But it actually seems to be true that although the medieval images, there's a great painting by cello, I think, as well, always seem to show the dragon being killed outright by St. George. It seems as though there was another step in the story. It's just that most of us aren't aware of it, and we don't have the iconography. We certainly don't have. I mean, if somebody might have another version of it, I'd love to hear it. But I guess I found what was so compelling about that sort of two-step execution of the dragon is that it's sort of, I think, for the teller of the story at the time, it emphasized George's connection to Jesus and the choice that the townspeople would have to make on their own to follow him and to understand how he'd been armed by his Christian faith to defeat this personification of evil. I mean, the deeper reading of the story is also that by retelling the story of this sort of virginal, both the princess and George, in some versions you're supposed to get married, but actually they don't get married because they're Adam. They're sort of virginal creatures without sin. And the story supposedly is that the dragon is the devil, and that they're recreating the sort of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Only this time, Adam wins, and they don't have to leave, and they can live without sin. So it's, there are many different readings of how the myth can function as a kind of triumphant text of the success of this relative upstart religion at the time over the temporal powers around it. People asked about other performances. Tim and I have done these performances, many of which are collected at a site called endlessbrokentime.org. Julia can post it. There's about 15 different performances with transcriptions there. And you'll see some of the other versions, other stories that take on this form. I hope we will be able to put this story up too. Were there other questions? I'm not looking directly at the question in the chat room.
Karen, do you want to ask a question?
Hey, Karen.
Hey, Matt. I'm curious. You generally end your classes when you teach them with the challenges exercise of 3 things that you push people to do that are like completely in the opposite direction of what they normally do within their art.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you would give yourself as the challenges, especially as you face having so many kind of changes within yourself that are coming from the outside. What would you give yourself as the assignment of 3 things that would be against your own grain?
That's not fair. Well, I mean, I think in a way, you put your finger on what I think is, I'll see if I can answer the question directly and not be sneaky about it. Well, the question you asked to me goes to the heart of how pedagogy works for, at least in art for me and maybe for a lot of people. The reason I asked that question to people, the reason I thought it was a provocative question, it comes out of a Lars von Trier film called The 5 Obstructions, is that I felt like as artists, we often fall into habits, ways of thinking or working that function well for us, and that only under special circumstances do we try to get out of them. And that the class system where the students and the teacher agree that they're going to participate in a kind of experiment in learning gives a kind of social situation in which you feel free to make those challenges to yourself. And that under the sort of rules of the game, there's not an existential challenge to your own work. And the reason that appeals to me, I think, is because I recognize in myself that very weakness. And the only reason I make other people do it is because I feel it is so hard for me to do. Even when I think I'm trying to liberate myself, I'll always return to what is secure. And it's also true that that's how the game is played in the class or in the movie. No matter what somebody says, if I tell somebody who's always doing a performance piece not to do a performance piece, it doesn't really help them to not do a performance piece, except that maybe now they'll have that in their vocabulary, but they'll also find a way back to whatever it is that is the core of their work, just through a different network. And that insight, both that you can change and that you have a certain kind of integrity about your work itself. It's not that there's a problem, it's that you don't understand quite how profound your own connection with your practice is. But I feel the exercise can work in two ways. I think in some ways, it goes back to my freshman year in college when I wasn't an art major, but I went to one art class, and I really wasn't used to any kind of conceptual teaching. And at the end of the first day of class, the teacher gave everybody a piece of white paper and said, take this home and make the most beautiful thing in the world out of it. And I took it home and I was really upset. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Am I supposed to draw a flower, or paint a tree, or I had very, very literal ideas, and I knew they were inadequate. And that sort of metastasized into a kind of hostility towards the assignment itself, which I decided was stupid, and I never went back. But it did tell me how closed off I was from a challenge that was outside my experience or my comfort zone. I suppose if somebody, I don't know what I would tell myself. I guess I would try to, if somebody did what somebody tried to tell me to change everything about what I did, I think I would try to do something that was simple and muted, that took up space without making space, and somehow happened in an instant. I mean, those would be the things I would find to be challenges to my own desire to sort of fill space and time, and the universe with this sort of cacophony of words and images. The first show I think I did in New York was called The Comfort and Safety of Numbers, that somehow if you just flood the zone with as many thoughts and gestures and indications of your earnestness and your commitment and your determination to do a good job, something would come out of that somebody could be respond to. I once asked Jude, who's also a wonderful art teacher, to give me an assignment I could pass on to my students. And she said, be so. It's an assignment I never would have made, but it sort of shows you how and then it turned out to be a very useful assignment. You don't have to give all that information. Sometimes the simplest thing generates the most interesting and profound response. And as with most things, you can learn that intellectually, but not necessarily internalize it and live by it. So it's good to be reminded of that. a framing device. It looks like a stone tablet. Oh, the rectangle that I use. It's funny. It's a good question. Normally, this is the first time I've drawn in this position with a piece of paper this size and dimension on the screen. And I normally draw horizontally, and I sort of understand that space in a different way. When I'm planning my stories, I don't know if you can see, I sort of storyboard them. I don't know what I'm going to draw, but I know sort of where I'm going to go. And I just found myself tonight every so often drawing that square within the square just to define the space I was going to be in, because I didn't really have an organized sense of how the drawing that I was going to make itself was going to be sort of preoccupied. Sometimes the drawings I do are not even drawings, they're just gestures or afterthoughts. If I wasn't sitting in a chair that I have to sit in for the rest of my life, probably I would be using charcoal or oil sticks and making a big mess. But because I need to stay relatively clean, I'm using the Sharpie. The Sharpie makes a smaller, less juicy, less interesting line, and it seems to leave a lot more space, empty space on the page. And I was a little bit at a loss. If you use more interesting drawing materials, you can get a little bit lazy and get more interesting drawings. In this case, I felt like I was halfway between trying to use drawing as gesture to underscore my text and also making images that themselves would lead you to another possible conclusion about what I was trying to say.
That's helpful. The rectangle was so similar every time that I was like, this must mean something.
This means that's my cartoon cell almost.
That's good. Thanks, Matt.
Receptor.
I'm going to read you a question from the comments, Matt. So this is from Aaron. I find it really interesting that you research all of these different stories. I can feel your background in anthropology. Would you say that you're researching the effects of these stories on societies or the story itself?
You buzzed out a little bit. The question was whether
Are you researching the effects of these stories on their societies or the story itself?
Another good question. I have to admit, I use the stories sort of like a really bad anthropologist. I'm aware of the audience I'm addressing more than I'm aware of the audience from which the story has sprung. I'm interested in the fact that, you know, a Korean mythology about a solar eclipse has explanatory power to their ethical system. I can describe that or say that, you know, we all must be mindful of each other's feelings during moments of great danger like an eclipse, and there's sort of underscoring morality and ethics in a society that comes out of that. And I can appreciate that. I'm interested in showing that to the audience that I have, which may or may not share that history. I once did a series of performances where I used like 7 or 8 different explanatory myths of creation, Greek and Chinese and African and Asian and Scientology and Western scientific, and it's interesting how they all reflected different sort of preoccupations within the culture with issues of causality and ethics. But I guess I want the audience to figure that out for themselves, and I'm more of a conduit, sort of absorbing these stories and passing them on, trying to make it clear that I'm not trying to be comprehensive or definitive. In my own anthropological studies, my thesis turned on a point like that, that I talked about in a performance a month or so ago, that Western psychologists have a way of measuring drive for achievement as they associate with Western capitalist activity. But you also find those drives very high in a culture like the Igbo in Nigeria. And the original mistake of Western psychologists and anthropologists was to say, they're just like us, because they could see a commonality in the way the numbers came out. But the nature of the reason that the Igbo have a drive for achievement that functions well in the Western colonial system is because of a comprehensive and completely culturally specific notion they have of this concept of a spirit, che, which is a kind of not just a personal, but a society-wide sense of purpose. So you can do the same thing that apparently drives you to behave in one way in one context. It means something else in its own context. You have to be very, very sensitive to that.
Thank you.
Other questions for Matt?
You guys have been very patient. You've gone over time. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces. I'm sorry I missed some of the stuff. I'll try to make it to some of the rituals that await us in the following week.
Gabe, you want to say hi?
Hi.
Matt, Gabe wants to say hi. Say hi.
Hey!
Okay, you can go.
Any stories? Anybody need to tell me anything I need to hear? Hey, Victoria.
Thanks, Matt. It's nice to see you. Hi, Jude. Is Jude around?
Judy's around. I think she's watching a horror movie with her earbuds in.
Perfect. Anyone else have questions for Matt? Hi, Dorothy.
Oh, wow.
Your mom, your brothers.
Mom and brother.
I don't see any volleyball people on here, but I was looking.
Really? The volleyball people, they talk a good game.
Oh, Tracy's iPhone. Maybe Tracy. Anyway, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for making it just as perfect as it always is in your current circumstances.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's beautiful to see.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. So awesome to see you.
Thank you.
Great to see everybody.
Thank you, Matt.
Very good, Matt. Thank you very much.
What?
Are we on?
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. You're incredible.
Hi, Matt. Thank you, Matt.
You have to be louder.
It's about it for me. Hi, Matt. Hi, Tom.
This is going to turn into a reunion if you guys.
Love you, brother. Great job.
Yes, dude.
Hi, Jude.
Yeah.
Hi, Dorothy. Hi, Tommy.
There's Tracy.
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Trace.
Hi, Jude.
Sorry, guys. We don't get to see each other very often, so bear with us.
Hi, Aunt Dorothy.
Hi, Lisa.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Lisa and Matt are cousins. This is what happens, Sam.
Yes.
Identical cousin.
These two are cousins.
I'm not actually related, but I feel like I am. I earned it.
Tracy, there's volleyball in the house. I see Tracy.
Yeah, there's volleyball. Here's another little one. Come here. You say hi to Matt.
Oh.
There's a Minna. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, guys. This was great. And I'm sure if you want to send Matt a message after the fact, if you think of a question, he'll answer it. Right, Matt?
Yes, I will. Definitely.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Matt. That was a true gift, honestly. I've actually never seen a Matt lecture, and I feel like now I'm a super fan.
Hi, Christine. Where did she go? Did she leave? I saw you. Hi, Chris.
I'm not going anywhere, so you guys don't have to say goodbye.
Yeah, he's staying in the chair. If you heard the lecture. Yeah. Anyway, you can hang out.
Yeah, if anybody has anything they want to share. Last time somebody began playing the clarinet, that's fine too.
Yeah.
Matt, since we're not leaving, I'll tell you that you gave me last year as my assignment, my last assignment, that I wasn't, as you might remember, I wasn't supposed to use technology. And so I built this thing in the river, and there's like clay and grass, and I was like really actually very proud of it. And so I went to I was like, I'm not using technology for the project. I'm just going to take a photo of it so I can remember, a little video. So I went and took a video, and of course the phone fell into the water. It was like the mat gods. And like I reached my arm, I was like, oh shit, and I reached in and pulled it out, put it in some rice, and it was actually fine. Well, like 3 weeks after residency, I was going through my photos, and I discovered that my phone took photos during its little underwater journey.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there's like 4 photos. I'll forward them to you. That it's like it going underwater, and then it goes into darkness, and then there's like a weird light, and then the last picture is like essentially of my armpit and like my like very disturbed face as I pull it up out of the water.
Oh my God.
So I just want to tell you like how powerful your assignments are. Like,
Well, I mean, that's a great story. You have to. I've been doing this daily Instagram story on English Spoken Time on Instagram, and if you watch it, it's essentially about what happens when you dive into the river.
oh, okay, I'll watch.
You must have inspired that whole thing.
Yeah, I'll forward you it.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
All right,
I
Matt.
think he wants to.
I'm just gonna say, love you, man, and
yeah.
I gotta go teach in the morning, so I'm gonna go to bed. So
Goodbye.
everybody, have a good night. It's great seeing you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Well, maybe I should say goodbye just to free everybody from it. This is how Freedman say goodbye, which is we always stay to the bitter end. Usually a boat is going out to sea or something, and you stand there waving and waving and waving. But it's considered very bad luck to actually turn away and walk away when your friend is still there waving.
Funny, that's what we call it the Schwadron goodbye. It's weird. Saying goodbye. Yeah. Just keep standing there.
That'll be my last obstacle. Say goodbye before it's time.
Bye, Maddie.
Bye, Mom.
Bye.
If my mom says goodbye, you all have to go.
Okay.
Mom.
Bye, honey.
Bye, Mom. All right, Lisa, now you have to go.
Oh, Matt, it was so good to see you. It was so good to see everybody. It was like a family reunion. So thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Dorothy, Tom, Josh, everybody.
Great to
Bye-bye.
see you too.
Right.
Thank you.
Not very often does an art talk turn into a family reunion, but. All right, I guess I'll have to be the teacher. Goodbye, everybody. I'm signing off.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Love you all. See you later in the week.
Love you all.
Bye.
Bye, Matt.
I love you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Matt.
Bye, Matt. Thank you.